Thank you so much for joining us today for Data Unpacked. We will be talking about GBA's work in sustainability data reporting and follow up from our Frankfurt workshop. My name is Jorin Pintna. I am the project manager for GBA, and I am joined today by other GBA members, Lauren Stewart, also with BookNet, Karina Urquhart, also with with BIC, and then Brian O'Leary will be joining us shortly, also from BISG. So a bit of an overview of today's conversation. We are going to be going over sort of the background that led up to the Frankfurt discussion. We will be talking about a summary of GBA's proposal. That is something that you are also all sent in sort of the pre-email, so hopefully you've had the chance to take a look at it. And then we will be doing a bit of a recap of what we talked about in Frankfurt and kind of just what the general thoughts were on the proposal and steps moving forward. We will then move into a Q&A portion, which is also time where we would like to hear from you. So if you do have any questions or thoughts or comments on what we will be talking about today, please feel free to save them for then. And then finally wrapping up with next steps and sort of our actionables. So a little bit just about GBA. We were formed in 2020, and it is a collaboration among BIC, BookNet, and BISG. This is also a good time to mention that GBA does depend on our supporters to fund our work. So if you have attended our events, have found this information or our resources useful, or really believe in a greener publishing industry, consider backing GBA so we can continue to fund this work. You can learn more about supporting GBA. The link should be in the chat now. Okay, moving into a little bit of background on sustainability data collection. So sustainability data collection and reporting is relatively new for book publishing. So as I'm sure many of you know, we are still trying to figure things out. And the launch of the Publishers Compact did prompt, I think, a lot of deeper thinking about reporting. And then IPA's Publishing Accelerator 2030 project also started multiple work streams. I'm going to touch on that a little bit later, but in general, this is sort of where we're at. There is a lot still to do, but I think it has become a big focus, which is also why GBA is spending more time looking into it. However, there are many unanswered questions. What data should we collect to inform a carbon calculation? Where do we find the data we need to report our carbon footprint? Do we need to calculate carbon footprints for books or for the company? How should we store this data and for how long? And what agreements do we need for how data is obtained, calculated, and reported? Unfortunately, we do not have all the answers to these questions, but GBA understands that this needs to be a collective effort. It is something that needs to be in discussion and won't work unless, multiple parties across the supply chain are on board. So these are the things that we are thinking about and working towards. Okay, moving into a little bit of background on the convening in Frankfurt. So we had about 25 industry professionals, I think some of which are on this call now. We initially met online in September in a working group to review a proposed approach. And I know also some of you were present for that, so thank you for being here again. And before the book fair, we drafted the proposal, which again was attached to your confirmation emails for registering for this event on how to tackle sustainability data reporting. And then in Frankfurt, we reviewed, modified, and endorsed the draft proposal. Now, something that we have stressed and want to continue to point out is that even if you cannot be attending those in-person events, we absolutely want this to be a collective effort. So we are still looking for feedback on the proposal. We still would like to hear any thoughts that come up. We're not necessarily like immediately moving forward with all of this, which is partly why we are reviewing everything that happened in Frankfurt today. To make sure that everybody can just be working from the same page. So let us talk just briefly about the proposal. Hopefully you've had the chance to review it. But the five main components are: one, rely on the greenhouse gas protocol for calculating emissions. If you have not heard of the greenhouse gas protocol, the link should be in the chat for more information on that. But that is sort of the bones of what we're talking about when we talk about calculating emissions. This is a method that has been used to develop a lot of the tools that we are seeing that are more publishing industry specific. However, greenhouse gas protocol can be complex. It might be a big undertaking, and it might not be possible necessarily for all companies. So we have also proposed that smaller companies could use a less data intensive model. An example of this is the carbon calculation guide for publishers, which this link should also be in the chat now, which is a much more compressed, way of calculating carbon emissions. Yes, it may not be, as effective as something as widespread and reaching as the greenhouse gas protocol. But again, we know that people are starting from different points. This is also a good time to mention that there is a group of Canadian publishers who have produced a carbon calculator for printing and another for calculating an organization's carbon footprint. They are anticipated to release soon, so they're not yet available. But GBA actually plans to host our next webinar. I know we're already trying to get you to the next thing. January 15th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time in 2025 to discuss the calculators and to delve into carbon calculation for publishers. So registration for that event will probably open in early December, so definitely keep an eye out for that. The next thing is using third-party services is a make or buy decision. So there are many organizations and companies who will do the calculations of emissions and storing that information in data for you. But obviously that comes at a cost. And so whether or not you develop an internal system within an organization or you choose to, source that work out, that is a decision that each organization basically needs to make for themselves. And it is like weighing the costs of making or buying. And then the GBA will continue to work with the Publishing Accelerator 2030 to explain model components, and GBA to create an explainer document to position frameworks, service providers, etc. for the industry. So GBA's position in all of this is to really try and disseminate this information, answer questions, and connect the right people to the information that they're looking for. Let's move into the structure of the Frankfurt conversation. So what we're going to talk about next is basically what happened in Frankfurt for those of you who are not there, and even for those of you who may have been there, recapping kind of what our main points were. So we reviewed the proposal and the related materials in a full group, evaluated the draft proposal and developed consensus in smaller groups. We then did an activity called Rocks and Fishes, where we identified rocks or barriers, impediments to accomplishing kind of our proposed approach, and fishes, which would be things that would help us or enable us to take steps towards the proposed approach. And this is actually something that we are still interested in getting feedback on. So as we have circulated the proposal, if you do have any thoughts on this, we will also maybe come back to this in the Q&A section. And then finally, brainstormed next steps and public communication. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Lauren and then Karina and then Brian to talk a little bit about what we heard from our participants in Frankfurt on these various subjects. So Lauren, I'll turn it to you.
Thanks a lot. In Frankfurt, we asked attendees to review the proposal, which you've received the outline of here, and it's also in the chat if you haven't already bookmarked that or saved it to your own Google Drive. And then we also debriefed attendees in person and kind of walked through as we just did here. Once we completed that, breaking into the smaller groups, we had a sort of facilitated guided discussion relating to the proposal. And so Karina and I are kind of going to walk through that now. And on this slide, you can see the collected feedback from attendees and those who submitted feedback since our last webinar that happened before Frankfurt. You'll see some of the threads that on this slide that will also weave into subsequent feedback slides and reinforces the areas that at GBA we're going to have to pay attention to going forward. So working with organizations across the supply chain, this became a common theme, with participants requesting that carbon reporting should be built into workflows at associations and member organizations. Moreover, participants advocated a change management approach that identifies sponsors and influencers at those various associations, organizations, and also the individual staff therein. Throughout that process, an additional benefit would be that so-called catalyst organizations could be identified and partnered with to drive change in specific parts of the supply chain or among a subset of partners. And attention to change management principles continued with the assertion that the GBA model and share how to keep up, to engage change, and to engage others. And one unanswered question at the moment relates to the choice to prioritize carbon at the exclusion of plastics, water, biodiversity, and workers. There was a shared belief that sustainability naturally extends beyond just paper, beyond greenhouse gas protocols, beyond carbon. However, there was consensus that engagement, particularly at the start of this data reporting experiment, should be the priority, with a mindset that focusing on the big things to start is a way to go. I think we can move to the next slide. Thank you. This slide shares participant feedback on necessary tactics to implement the proposal. A major call is one that will be familiar to many on this call, the need for validated reporting that adheres to recognized standards and best practices. Some of you may recall the call that we had before the meeting in Frankfurt, where it was agreed to not reinvent the wheel and use established reporting criteria and methodology. That was heard and agreed upon in Frankfurt. Relating to that is the request to ensure organizations are using current data sets, which will necessitate that the GBA acts as a trusted knowledge source and thought leader to disseminate updates to the publishing community, and a role that we're happy to take on. And immediately, the GBA will have to identify opportunities to translate the proposal and its recommendations into local languages. For example, in Canada, that would necessitate finding a French-Canadian partner to represent and transmit information into the French market. Participants also recommended that a timeline for this proposal, as well as other deliverables and project work, should be identified with regular planned intervals to update, engage with you, our community, and you can see that that's already in the works. Another tactical suggestion was to deploy a so-called sustainability accelerator with, for example, 4-week courses with 20-minute modules, just as an example, to bring everyone up to date on the terms and establish a common lexicon. Another interesting suggestion was to infuse sustainability into the various paperwork that supply chain participants engage in. So for example, the one listed on this slide here was that any quote generated for a publishing project, like from a printer, would come with core sustainability data points as a default, such that it can be a part of a holistic quote review. And through this process, it has become clear that the GBA has a role to play to support its members, the national supply chains that we all represent, as well as the larger global publishing community. And this will necessitate the identification of a path forward to greater financial and human resources, and development will be something that we pay attention to going forward. And I'll pass you over to Karina.
Great, thanks, Lauren. Oh, can you hear me? Can you hear me okay?
I hear you fine.
I hear you.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Lauren, and thanks, Jaren, as well. So thoughts on the proposal from the Frankfurt work group. So the general feeling in that session, in the workshop, was supportive, and that the proposal was a positive step forward to at last have a direction for an agreed industry approach to carbon reporting be proposed. The proposal, as we know, will need some work in response to the feedback and any subsequent feedback that we may gather from today and perhaps even later. But that was part and parcel of what we agreed to do at Frankfurt and what we have agreed to do going forward. Part of our ongoing work at the GBA will be to refine and further develop and expand upon the initial draft proposal. But in essence, it was generally agreed at Frankfurt that we're off to a really good start. Further feedback was as follows. It was agreed that larger organisations, regardless of their type and wherever they may happen to sit in the book supply chain, do need to embrace the greenhouse gas framework or protocol. Where organisations say that they're complying, it was felt that it would be really helpful to be able to verify, if possible, to what extent they do comply. However, it was recognised that when it comes to smaller or perhaps even medium-sized organisations, they might find the GHG protocol too overwhelming, as Jarin has already alluded to. But equally, it was felt that whatever alternative was proposed, that it should still be along the same parameters as the greenhouse gas protocol, and that the GHG should most definitely not be dumbed down, as it were, for those organisations, but rather it should be made easier for smaller players to report, if that makes sense. So, for example, could a less data-intensive tool be proposed to address a reduced version of the protocol, greenhouse gas protocol's elements for SMEs, using only a selection of protocol components? So, for example, using 6 out of 10, or 20 out of 50, or whatever we may agree upon. It came through very clearly at Frankfurt that it's important not to splinter or split the reporting protocol proposed, which could see different sized organisations heading off in different directions, which is something we really want to avoid. And that we should always be proposing and comparing apples with apples. So it was noted that larger organisations in Europe already have social responsibility, due diligence policies and legislation to comply with. And there was also a concern raised about possible duplication, as there are many carbon calculators out there. So we just need to be careful that that our proposal doesn't double up, or that it clarifies that concern. It was felt that it would be helpful to offer practical explanations, particularly for smaller organisations, about the core components of the model to be used for carbon calculation. As Lauren, I think, has just mentioned, how it works, things to consider, how-to guides or sessions, for example, how to collect and then input the data, how to make the calculations, how to influence the calculations, how can you reduce your carbon footprint, which elements will provide a quick win in terms of reducing your carbon footprint, and so on. To this end, it was thought that the GBA could work with the Publishing Accelerator project, and the format of these practical explanations wasn't necessarily agreed upon at Frankfurt, but I suspect we could do something along the lines of a series of webinars with helpful hints and tips, papers or explainers, etc., etc. And this would help definitely address the pressing need, certainly the need that was voiced in the Frankfurt workshop for guidance and direction, with some in the room saying that they simply wanted to be told what to do, that they don't have time to research, to look into every possible option. They just want access to something actionable, as they're incredibly time and resource poor. So if we could go to the next slide, please, Jarin, that would be great. Thank you. So this section is really about more information. What else was needed in the proposal? So one of the areas that came up was, how do ISO, or even do ISO standards, relate to the greenhouse gas protocol? ISO standards aren't referenced yet in the proposal, and so that relationship needs to be understood and fleshed out a bit more, as it's currently missing. And it was felt that this would provide some good context for further understanding of the relationship between the two. Another area was a request for GBA to create inspirational case studies of different sized organisations. There was generally a need expressed that sustainability data collection and reporting often feels daunting or overwhelming, and very often people just really don't know where to start, particularly if an organisation is small or medium-sized, or perhaps any organisation, especially if they're starting out on their sustainability journey. Case studies of different size and types organisations would help to provide some pointers, inspiration and practical hints and tips. The Frankfurt workshop group asked if the GBA could create a curated list of third parties that charge for services related to data collection. And we have thought about this, and we would need to give it a bit more thought. But if we did, we'd have to be clear that it's not a list of recommendations. Being neutral, the GBA can't really recommend third-party suppliers, but we could definitely look into what a directory might might look like, if that was helpful. Another gap was the how for data collection. That was missing. We need to, I think the proposal may need to explain further how the data is being first collected, and how frequently, how up to date is it, and then how long is it being kept for, and how is it being retrieved? What access will there be to the data, by whom, and where will the central collection point be? Which brings me on to the next point. As you would expect, there was a lot of conversation in the workshop about the creation of data and the data reporting. That's what the workshop was for. But a key area that was considered missing was the need for a central library of sustainability data that can be reliably accessed for data retrieval, reporting, information purposes, etc. So this would be no small undertaking, whoever did this, but it certainly needs further thought and should ideally be incorporated in some way into the proposal. So that's the end of the comments, if you like, the participant comments from the workshop on the proposal that we submitted and talked through at Frankfurt. So over to you, I believe. Now, Brian?
Yep. So Durin had suggested an exercise that we conduct in Frankfurt, and it turned out to be particularly helpful. It was called Rocks and Fishes, just essentially to identify rocks, what we consider impediments, and fishes, fundamentally enablers or supporters of implementation. So we wanted to talk first about the particular challenges with respect to rocks. Some of the folks who were looking at the proposal said the steps seem really big to take on, that it didn't seem as actionable. And this ties a little bit back to what Karina was just describing, which is that people are busy. They're not necessarily going to understand everything there is to know about sustainability. It's a big topic. And how can we make it both more actionable and a little bit less daunting? There was the observation that organizations seem to lack knowledge on what to do first and next. Again, that directional approach is, I think, really helpful and consistent with what Karina was describing in terms of feedback on the proposal. One of the things that we're combating is this perception that sustainability is somehow something either new or extra or not worth doing, and not necessarily a core part of how it is that we operate as members of the publishing community. And so explaining that both making it straightforward to participate and to do things that are sustainable in nature and to gather information that informs you about whether you are acting in a sustainable manner, but also to explain why the value of it is important for the industry as a whole. There was this isn't new to anyone who works in book publishing, particularly not on the trade association side. But there's a fear that, if you collect data that shows your carbon footprint, as an example, the data is used against you. That effectively, if your carbon footprint is not as good as a competitor's, that it costs you sales. So being able to explain the incremental nature of improvement and establishing baseline and not having it used as a competitive threat is certainly something we have to think about. The other piece of the puzzle that it's evident to anyone who's spent any time in this part of the business, expectations change, regulatory changes occur, understanding changes, but also your own understanding of your carbon footprint and how you operate in a competitive environment improves over time, and you see opportunities. Keeping up with those requirements and expectations, I think, is a real challenge, and without losing hope or momentum. Excuse me, I am suffering from a little bit of a cold. The last piece is what we describe in 2 words as analysis paralysis, that we became that players can become so driven by data that they're not sure what to do next, or that they're consumed only with collecting and perhaps reporting data, and not taking action to either change the carbon footprint or change the outcomes that are measured as part of a sustainability effort. So kind of giving people enough information so that they can understand where they are, but not so much information or require so much information that all they do is collect data and not necessarily take action. So those are, in summary, those are kind of the rocks. But we also we ended the conversation by saying, well, what things are working in our favor? What are the fishes as we described them in Turin's model? Top of the list was international consensus. That people understand that this is an important thing. There is, I mean, I live and work in the United States. Certainly is a component, a political component of arguments against climate change. But I don't think that that's necessarily the scientific or the international consensus. There are simple free tools. Some of them are already available. Others, such as one that's being developed in the Canadian marketplace, will be released, we hope, shortly. And they offer the ability to get a good sense, maybe not a perfect sense, but a good sense of what your carbon footprint is today. And if you know that, then you can continue to measure it. And it may not even be so important that you know everything you need to know today, but rather to know everything you need to know to improve. Because we're not necessarily comparing organization to organization, but organization to its own performance a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago. That's kind of the benefit of doing this over time. There are some really good business arguments for sustainability, and one of the things that the Green Book Alliance is looking at is just effectively packaging them and sharing them. It's not new information on our part, but it's certainly something that we can share with the global book publishing industry. Buy-in from paper is pretty strong. I think paper has been trying to operate in a sustainable manner for quite some time. There are standards like FSA and recycled paper in particular that are well understood within the industry. They've also been regulated in some cases because they use chemicals and other processes that require them to take care of effluent, wastewater, et cetera. So it's a part of our business that is very familiar with both environmental and sustainability regulations. There are some case studies, and there was, in general, in comments when people were trying to figure out things that would be enablers, the notion of ballpark numbers. You know, that if, for argument's sake, 70 or 80% of your carbon footprint comes from your consumption of paper, then obviously that's the first thing on your list. If the next 10% or 15 is from printing, that's the second one. But that kind of thing is, you can get to a quick and dirty on the level of a book, and certainly on the level of an organization, to be able to start to assess where you are in the business. Other things that were suggested as potential tools: mentorships, partnerships, use of graduate programs in publishing. In the North American market, there are 5 or 6 such programs that are very influential. In Canada, for example, Simon Fraser is a particularly good university based in Vancouver, and in the US, NYU, Pace in New York, Portland State in the Western United States, and a few others are all opportunities to reach people with programming and hopefully educate the future leaders of the industry on the importance of this topic. There was an emphasis too for us to and for other organizations to do more and more frequent and more transparent communications about what's actually happening. A suggestion for training courses that would be useful, particularly for smaller organizations. Larger players, larger publishers in particular, have the resources to do this and the critical mass of staff. But if you're a small publisher with a smaller list, having access to training courses would be really useful. And then it was suggested that there are models from other industries. Karina mentioned the idea of having essentially carbon reporting at the level of I'm sorry, this was actually Lauren's contribution in part. The kind of reporting on it at the level of an invoice, what the carbon footprint would be, or at the level of a quote. We already see that for things like shipping and air travel. You can get if you sign on to your airline, most of them will tell you what the carbon footprint is for the travel that you're planning. And in some cases, they'll offer you the opportunity to buy offsets. While we don't have necessarily a uniform point of view on offsets, not all of them are created equal. At the very least, it's possible for an airline to tell you what the carbon footprint is, and we're wondering if we can't do something similar and borrow from that experience to inform book publishing. So it was I think it was at the end of that morning, a robust and positive discussion. People were generally not, they were realistic about what was possible, but they were also very optimistic that we were starting on a path that would allow us to do more and better things going forward. And with that, I think I'll turn it back to you, Jiren.
Thank you very much, Lauren and Brian and Karina, for going through all of that. So just to recap those high level takeaways, we had general support for the draft of the proposal. At Frankfurt, we had agreement that working with established frameworks and players can help us move forward. We also had agreement that smaller players need special consideration, and agreement that GBA can play a key role in communicating these agreements to book industry supply chain. So there are several rocks and some fishes to follow up on. And again, we want to continue to this conversation. So now that even kind of everybody who is in this meeting right now has had a bit of a chance to catch up on what we talked about in Frankfurt, we'd like to kind of move forward in continuing that discussion and seeing if there are other rocks or fishes or thoughts or comments, concerns with the proposal. Before we move into a bit of Q&A, just Brian, Karina, and Lauren, do you have any final thoughts that you wanted to mention about what it was like to kind of be in that discussion on Frankfurt, or should we just move into hearing what people think?
I'll just say something really quickly. Just generally, the atmosphere in the room was really positive. People were very keen. There was a general sort of sense of eagerness and willingness to, first of all, offer feedback on the proposal and consider all the elements, but also just generally, people want to be doing the right thing, but I think they only want to do it once, so they want to do it in the right place once. They don't want to have to do, carbon reporting over here, then carbon reporting over here as well, and then a different type of reporting for carbon over here. They just want one industry recognized place to do it. And again, I think what came across repeatedly was the time poor. Now, that's not necessarily the smaller organizations, it could be the larger organizations as well. The need for really actionable guidance. So there were quite a few participants in the room that just wanted to be told what do I need to do, how do I need to do it, where do I go to do it. So I think that's a really important thing that we need to keep in mind. That was my sort of general top level observations of the sort of the vibe in the room and the general sort of attitude to the session.
Yeah, and I would describe it in a similar way as very business-like. People were trying to get to the bottom of what it is that's expected of them and what they can do, and practical in that nature. I think the morning overall was awesome because we've been working as the Green Book Alliance for 4 years, and this is the first time we've hosted an in-person meeting. The three of us have meet on an every other week basis, and we do a lot. But it was exciting to be able to take the understanding we have and the commitment we have, and then see it reflected in a lot of the people who are working with us around the room. So,
agree, totally agree.
Okay, with that, we're going to move into Q&A. So this is an opportunity for open questions, but even before we start on that, Natalie, can we get those polls ready to launch? We are just going to ask the group a couple things because we want to continue talking about this. So the first thing is truly just, are you already collecting sustainability data? And please throw in your answers.
Here they come.
People didn't know they were going to be asked questions.
Surprise.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
Okay, wonderful.
To answer Brad Farmer, that there will not be a test. Brad Farmer is fortunately one of the people who was able to make the workshop in Frankfurt and contributed many of the ideas that you've heard us talk about today.
Wonderful. So even from where we're at, it looks like over half of people on this call are already collecting sustainability data, which is amazing. Of course, we're probably a little skewed in our sample group, as you are people who have chosen to attend this meeting. However, we'd like to open the floor. So I'm going to stop sharing this so we can see people. And we'd like to hear from you. Either throw it in the comments or raise your hand if you want to talk in person. But can you elaborate on that? If you are collecting sustainability data, have you conducted a carbon audit at your firm, or have you experimented with carbon calculators? Are you collecting data other than carbon emissions? And if you're not collecting sustainability data, what is the main barrier for that, or what are you hoping to? Does anybody have any thoughts on that? We'd love to.
Folks are shy.
Nobody wants to say.
Brad would like to say something.
Yeah, I'll chime in a little bit. So thanks for doing this and for kind of opening up the Green Book Alliance and the conversations that you've been having to a broader group that may not have been aware. I think this is really, really helpful, and the Frankfurt session was helpful. So I think a question, and then to respond to what the question that you posed. The question is kind of, where do we go from here? What are some of the next steps, and the time frame and timeline, and where we'd like to go? And then as far as what we're collecting as far as sustainability, we use a variation of the New Society kind of calculator. That was new to me, but we kind of came up with our own Excel spreadsheet on that one. And basically, but the problem is it's not geographically sensitive or even sensitive to the particular printers and particular papers. So it's just a very generic, this is what a worldwide average carbon footprint for these kind of production things are. And then we do compensate for where it comes from in terms of the transit and transportation, whether it's coming truck or boat or those kinds of things. But the actual production scope 3 piece is still a black box to us that we just don't know.
Oh, we have one in the comments from 910 Publications. Kim said, I'm a one-woman show and ours is a startup press. One barrier is time. I already do all the things. Another is that I don't know where to find the data or how to validate reports from vendors we work with to ensure it's not more greenwashing than accurate. Finally, I don't know what I'd do with the data if I had to. So super high level stuff. We've also got Aaron. Princeton has created a form we send to vendors, but the response rate hasn't been great. Printers are most forthcoming regarding paper, but even that's difficult because they often don't want to disclose specific brand names as far as energy and emissions. We are working on our scopes 1 and 2, but the scope 3 is kind of overwhelming. Yes, we've also heard scope 3 being challenging.
Yeah, but what you're hearing from both Kim and Aaron in those comments is very much in line with what we heard in Frankfurt. And it's something that's front of mind for us as we think about what practical things we're going to be doing over the next few months.
Does anybody else have any thoughts or comments on that?
I know that I think we have somebody from 2K Denmark here. 2K's principals had both participated in the Frankfurt workshop. I don't know if they have anything that's directly responsive to the question of, are you currently collecting data?
Hi, Brian. I hope you can hear me. Sorry, the video is not working. I think it's everything is great. One of the key takeaways from the Frankfurt bookshop was really getting a sense of direction. Like everybody is using the same measurement, and then as these discussions go on, we can help people gather the necessary data for their Scope 3 emissions and so on. I know that it can seem very overwhelming, but I think going forward, we can do these sort of templates that can help get people in the ballpark, really.
Thank you so much. And we're just seeing in the chat also, yes, Scope 3 for publishers. Okay, let's move into our next quick poll, which is focusing more on the proposal. So we obviously asked our Frankfurt participants if they, in general, agreed with and support GBA's proposal for how we're tackling sustainability data collection. So we would like to make sure that that gets included also for this group. So far, it's looking like mostly yeses. Okay. Well, with this poll, we have 100% consensus, which is excellent. Though, if you do have any comments or concerns or things that you may disagree with or have questions about, and you maybe don't want to put it right now in front of everybody, we would like to hear about this because it is absolutely still in development. Moving forward, the strongest proposals will come from, having them also be challenged as well, which I think was also done in our Frankfurt workshop. So that's great. Okay, and let's just move forward and throw the last poll out, which is just, do you anticipate GBA's proposal for sustainability data collection working or being feasible for your company in the next year? Now, I know that's a lot, but just
this is what's called the Dream Tough Love part of the program.
What we want to know. It's looking almost 50-50. Yes, people are saying yes, but sort of kind of. We'd love to hear, okay, kind of why? Is that coming back to the difficulty of time? We've obviously heard, like, what specific barriers are you thinking about with this specific in the next year, and how GBA has proposed this working? We are good with kind of, but we would love to get that kind of to a yes. And what can GBA or this collective group of people be doing to support kind of to getting to a yes? Alternatively, if you said no, we would love to hear why. Yeah, we're at like 50-50. Yes, finding data and then sorting out what to do with data.
That why, or the maybe how to help. Brian, you mentioned, and it came up in Frankfurt, that some, particularly for publishers, their Scope 3 suppliers are concerned about how the data will be used. I wonder if an activity that the GBA could engage in that would help everyone deal with a lot of the concerns that have come up today is if we really articulated why this is important specifically. Obviously, we know it's important from a macro perspective in making the publishing industry greener and more sustainable. But if it was, I think in Europe, there's some, it's a little bit easier because there's a specific regulation you are reporting to. We are doing this and it's important because the government is making us. You know, we have to do this because, and here's the date and here's the deliverable. I think in the US, it's a little vaguer as to which thing is most important and why am I doing this? Exactly how will it be used and how will it move us all forward? I think the GBA has a role to play in specifying and prioritizing. Yes, we decided carbon footprint is where we're going to start, but really giving particularly those suppliers who then provide data for publishers to be able to fill in their scope 3, telling them this is why it really matters that you do this, and this is how your customers will use it in a good way.
Thank you so much, Ashley. Absolutely, I think we do see that as a role that GBA can be playing. And yeah, 2025. We're also seeing in the comments EUDR reporting being a big focus right now, and it being challenging to tackle multiple things at once. Absolutely. Okay, in a more open space, we probably have 5 to 10 minutes. Does anybody have any thoughts, questions, concerns, either breaking off a little bit from this or on the proposal? Is there anything that we would also love to hear, just as Ashley just said, if there are things that you are hoping to see from GBA in the next year? We're beginning to plan, our next webinars. Beth has said, in the US, I think dealing with the impact of possible tariffs is going to take center stage. We understand how critical this is, but the resources are scarce. Resources, of course, absolutely are, I think, a big impediment, a rock, so to speak. Brian, what are your thoughts on where we see GBA going next? I am going to talk about next steps in our kind of upcoming webinars and events, the consensus at Frankfurt about what support people are needing and how GBA could play a role in that.
Yeah, well, I think I'm very mindful. We spend a lot of time thinking about EUDR and more recently tariffs as a function of the US election. But I think the support for the plan, both in Frankfurt and today, is pretty solid. So we don't have a regulatory force. The fact that we roll it out in the US market and it doesn't get uptake doesn't mean it's dead. It means the tools are there and people have to spend their time doing other things. But we'll continue to work on it. So I think we're on a good path. We just have to recognize realistically that it may take longer to get there than we would like, but that's reality.
Absolutely. Okay. I am going to bring us back to here. Okay. I'm going to move through a couple more things, but if you have any other thoughts, questions, comments, concerns, feel free to pop them in the chat, or of course send us an email afterwards. It can be daunting to be put on the spot and have to take a bunch of quiz questions in a webinar you thought you were just going to get to watch. Okay, so one thing, we know that everybody is starting from different places. So we have actionables for those just starting out. some resources that you can go to, some things that you should be familiar with if you are engaging in the sustainability landscape in publishing, just to know terminology and better understand what's happening. The first is IPA's Publishing Accelerator 2030. You should know and understand the 3 initial work streams. Link to it in the chat. I'm sure many of us are already familiar with this, but if you're not, this is an excellent place to start. They have, some of the work streams are on carbon emissions and calculations and what this is going to be, could be used for, and the benefits, and this is a great place to start. The second thing is the Sustainability Services Ecosystem Map. We heard a lot, especially at the start, about what are all these companies doing and which one's better and how do we choose? And this is not an endorsement of any of these specifically, but it at least breaks things down. So you should know what the different companies and organizations do, the difference between companies that do measurement and disclosure versus capacity building and engagement versus strategy and net zero transition plans versus external stakeholder relationships like ESG or events. So that a link to that should be in the chat as well. And that is something really helpful to just visualize what is out there and the different things that are offered within sustainability services. And these are not necessarily publishing specific, but a lot of them apply. And then the final thing is GBA's Printer Publisher Sustainability Guide. If you don't know what kinds of questions to be asking, this is a great place to start. Now, the Sustainability Guide sort of was the precursor to moving into talking more specifically about sustainability data collection, because when we were getting feedback on the guide, people were saying, okay, so it says, what is the carbon footprint of the paper that you're using? But what if I don't know how to calculate that, or what, that is where we sort of moved into this current discussion. But the Sustainability Guide is a great place to start in looking for the different aspects of sustainability in the publishing supply chain and what you might want to be thinking about. Now, this is specifically curated to printers and publishers. We are looking to expand to include retailers and distributors at some point. But for now, it still has a lot of valuable information that I think would generally apply across the board in the supply chain. And it is divided based on, paper, certifications, packaging. So if you haven't already had the chance to take a look at that, we talk about it a lot. So maybe you have, but revisit it and make sure that's something that you're considering throughout these conversations as well, is what we're actually talking about and what aspects of the supply chain that they apply to. Okay, so the last thing from us is next steps for this effort. Our next GBA webinar, as I mentioned, will be January 15th. We're going to talk more about carbon calculators and carbon calculation for the publishing industry. I think that will launch early December. You'll be able to register for that. We will be doing an update at Context. We heard from Ashley a little earlier in this session. That will be March 10th, 2025, before the London Book Fair. And GBA will be giving a bit of an update and the potential to continue these discussions that we're having right now. We are working on developing maybe some programming to explain core aspects of the proposal, especially greenhouse gas protocol, as that is, both the meat and bones of what we're talking about in a lot of these conversations, but also one of the most complicated. And then continuing collaboration with Publishing Accelerator, BIC, BookNet, and BISG groups, of course. And then you will catch us back at Frankfurt 2025, which will be October 14th. I believe that is the Tuesday, and the same as we did this previous year before editors session. So these are some of the things where we're going to be continuing these discussions, and also what we're hoping to do moving forward to push this forward. We've also heard, I think, some great things today, maybe looking a little bit more into how we can support people with Scope 3 specifically, and talking more about the why this matters, why we're doing it, and when we should try and be doing it by. That is everything from us. So thank you so much for attending. If you do have any final thoughts or questions, do feel free to chime in. We have just a few minutes